1850. Compromise of 1850 is one of the most important events in all of U.S. history. So do you think it'll be on the test? I guarantee it. I'm telling you right now it will be. This is background and context. So the United States, coming out of the U.S.-Mexican War, just acquired all this new territory called the Mexican Cession. This territory is, as Ralph Waldo Emerson described it, a dose of arsenic to the Union, because you reopen the whole question of the spread of slavery to the territories, because you just got a whole bunch more territory. And you have three possible answers to this question. Should slavery be allowed to spread into the Mexican Cession? The North says absolutely no. Congressman David Wilmo of Pennsylvania it's pronounced Wilmo, not Wilmot. He comes forward at the very beginning of the war. Remember the Mexican War is 1846 to 48? So he comes forward at the very beginning of the war and says, if we get any territory from Mexico, that territory should be absolutely off limits to slavery. Like most Northerners, he sees slavery as immoral. He does not want it to spread. You're trying to contain slavery just like the United States contains communism during the Cold War. You don't want it to spread. You believe if it cannot spread, it will eventually implode and end of its own unworkability and immorality. Here's the attendance sheet. So this says no. Please write down and underline that the Wilmo proviso is just proposed. It is not passed. So this is proposed. Who do you think dislikes the Wilmo proviso? North? The North is the ones proposing. The South. The South absolutely despises the Wilmo proviso. To them, this is unconstitutional. And to understand that, you have to understand that the Southern position on the spread of slavery has been much more polarized by this time. Before this, they would admit that yes, Congress can tell a territory whether it's slave or free. And the Wilmo proviso is just telling territories whether they're slave or free. And even Southerners used to admit that Congress could do that back in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise. But here, by 1850, Southerners now insist that Congress can't even tell a territory whether it's slave or free, much less a state. And so their position is far more polarized. They're insistent that Congress has no authority over the spread of slavery whatsoever, and that all territories should be open to slavery. That is expressed by John C. Calhoun in his Senate Resolution of 1847. John C. Calhoun is the guy who was Jackson's vice president at first. Do you remember that? After he's done being vice president and resigns in the 1830s, he spends the next 20 years as the most prominent pro-slavery spokesman in the U.S. Senate. So he becomes like the #1 pro-slavery guy in the United States. He's the face of pro-slavery. He comes forward with a Senate resolution, and if you remember, we talked about resolutions. It's not a law. It's just a very formal statement of opinion. And he says, the Constitution protects the spread of slavery in the territories, and Congress has no authority to limit it whatsoever. Anybody else not sign the attendance sheet? This is very convoluted reasoning. Please pay careful attention here. You got to know this. This is going to be the standard pro-slavery argument all the way down to the Civil War. So you got to understand this argument. Remember the compact theory of the Constitution from the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798? We had those on the last test. That compact theory says the states created the Constitution, therefore the states are the boss of the federal government. Federal government's the employee, the states are the boss. State supremacy rather than federal supremacy. Under the compact theory, the states collectively own the territories together. The federal government does not own the territories. And under this system, the states collectively owning the territories have access to it just like it's the backyard of your house. So if all the states live together in one house, they all should have equal access to the backyard, is what his opinion is. And it's unfair for somebody from, say, Wisconsin to come over here to Nevada territory, and he can bring 100% of his property. Yet somebody from South Carolina who has property that includes slaves can't bring 100% of his property. He can only bring the percentage that does not include slaves. So he says it's unequal treatment before the law, and under the Fifth Amendment right to own property, that's unconstitutional. You need to understand something here. This is a very convoluted, pretzel-like twisting of the Constitution. The Constitution is not a pro-slavery document. It absolutely is not. If anything, the onus in the Constitution is that Congress should have the authority to ban slavery, and that slavery is a negative thing. The Constitution does not explicitly protect slavery anywhere. Anybody ever read the Fifth Amendment? That's what he's referencing here. Does the Fifth Amendment say anything about slavery? It doesn't. And so Calhoun's really grasping at straws. He's twisting the Constitution to say what he wants it to say, and it really just isn't even in there. This isn't even really a strict constructionist argument. This is more like an imaginary constructionist argument. Nevertheless, the Democrats and some of their Southern Whig allies have enough votes in the Senate to get a majority of the Senate to say that that's their opinion. So is this a law? Is this binding? No, a resolution is just a very formal statement of opinion. So it's not binding. Wilmo proviso, if that passes, would be binding. Finally, we have popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is an idea that is coined by this man here, Lewis Cass. He's a Northern Democrat from Michigan. He's running for president in 1848. Lewis Cass comes up with the idea of popular sovereignty because he's a Northern Democrat. He's running against the Whig Zachary Taylor in the election of 1848. See, Northern Democrats have a very razor's edge line to walk when it comes to slavery. If you're a Whig, you don't have this same problem. Which part of the country has more population, north or south? Definitely the north. By the time we get to 1860, if you look at the green area on the map, that green area outnumbers the yellow area by 4 to 1. So there's a lot more people living in the free states than in the south. So to become president, can you become president if you only carry the yellow areas on the map? Absolutely not, because the vast majority of the country lives in the green area. So to become president, you have to carry the north, or at least a significant portion of the north. To get northern votes, you can't be too strongly pro-slavery, because most northerners by this time are anti-slavery. So you can't be too pro-slavery if you expect to get northern votes for president. However, if you're a Democrat, you can't be too anti-slavery either, because the base of the Democratic Party is the South, and they won't pick you as their candidate in the first place if you're not, if you are too anti-slavery. So a Democrat has to be very careful not to be too anti-slavery, very careful not to be too pro-slavery when running for president. Whigs don't have that problem because the base of the Whig Party is in the north, and since most Whigs, most Northerners are anti-slavery, a Whig can come out and say things that are anti-slavery and not have the same political repercussions. So Lewis Cass comes up with this idea of popular sovereignty, and it's actually pretty brilliant. He's trying to say, look, Congress doesn't get to decide. Instead, let the people that live in the territory decide. So instead of Congress telling the territory of Nevada whether it's slave or free, you let the people in Nevada decide if they're slave or free. Let's look at our map again. This area here. If you use popular sovereignty in that area, do you think it's very likely that slavery will go there? Look at the purple areas. This is Utah, that's New Mexico. Can you grow cotton in either of those places? Can you grow tobacco in either of those places? Not really. So practically speaking, very, very unlikely that slavery will actually go there. But even though it's completely impractical that slavery would actually go there, both the North and the South, they don't care about whether it's practical or not anymore. All they care about is the principle. Will it go there? Probably not. Can it? Technically, yes. And then that's the big deal here. If it can spread, it must be stopped in the opinion of the North. And even if it won't really work there, the South insists that it must be allowed there. So that's the position of the two sides. So the first question dividing the United States leading up to the Compromise of 1850 is the question of the spread of slavery into the territories. Wilmot Proviso in particular is controversial. The South actually has a plan called the Nashville Convention in 1850. They plan that if the Wilmot Proviso passes and is not struck down, they will meet in Nashville in 1850 and plot to secede from the Union. This is a very real threat. If they had met at the Nashville Convention, they would have seceded. You would have disunion and civil war 10 years early. When does actual disunion and civil war occur? I'm sure you know when the Civil War was. I hope. You should have already read some about it in the textbook. 1861 to 1865. So the actual Civil War will be 61 to 65. This is 10 years early. You would have had the Civil War 10 years early if the Nashville Convention had gone through. But two other issues dividing the country leading up to the Compromise of 1850. One is the fugitive slave law. There's a federal law that says that a slaveholder may go to the North and reclaim escaped slaves and take them back into slavery. Northerners hate that because to them this is kidnapping free people and taking them back into bondage. Yeah, once you reach the North, you should be free. You're no longer a slave. Southerners don't like this law because to them it's just not strong enough. The North often ignores it, and slaveholders are not allowed to reclaim their slaves. So that's another issue dividing the country. How strong or weak, or whether this law exists at all, the fugitive slave law. Another problem facing the U.S. in 1850 is the slave trade in Washington, D.C. And please underline the word trade. Did I say slavery? Slave trade in Washington, D.C. The slave trade in Washington, D.C. France and Britain had already banned slavery by this point, and dignitaries from France and Britain visit the United States, and Northerners who are showing them around are embarrassed that human beings are being bought and sold literally within eyesight of the Capitol building. The United States is supposed to be the beacon of liberty. The United States is supposed to be the lamp up on the hill. And this kind of hypocrisy is very embarrassing. So you're not stopping slavery in Washington, D.C., but you are trying to stop the international, or well, the domestic slave trade in this case. Is this going to violate states' rights? If the federal government bans the sale of slaves in the District of Columbia, does that violate states' rights? Everybody's shy this morning? Don't want to say anything? I won't make you do push-ups if you get it wrong. If you violate this is not violating states' rights because D.C. is not a state. It's the District of Columbia. It's solely under the purview of the federal government and no one else. So even the most die-hard states' writer, I guarantee you they're not going to like it, but you can't make an argument that this violates states' rights. So the country is about to face disunion and civil war. This is the worst constitutional crisis yet up to this point. And the great compromiser is going to save the day once again. Who's that? Henry Clay. It's pretty much his last gasp. He's an old man by this time. He has to have help. And so Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois is his wingman here. And so Henry Clay and Stephen A. Douglas pushed through something called the Compromise of 1850. This is going to resolve this sectional crisis and keep the Union together and delay the Civil War another 10 years. First, California will be admitted into the Union as a free state. Go back to our map of the Mexican cession. See how huge California is as a portion of that? You have enough people, remember from the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, you have to have 60,000 free inhabitants to be a state. California, before 1849, definitely did not have 60,000 inhabitants of any sort, free or not. But because of the gold rush of 1849, you had this huge influx of humanity. You've got plenty of people there to be a state now. But most of those people live over here. You didn't have to have the borders of California drawn so large. They draw them extra large on purpose to put as much land behind the borders of a free state. Therefore, it's off limits to slavery. Put as much land off limits to slavery as possible. Even diehard states' writers admit that a state has the right to decide if it's free or slave. Is California a territory? Remember, pay careful attention to those words, territory or state. California is a state. So even John C. Calhoun and your diehard pro-slavery persons could not say that that's somehow illegal. They're not going to like it, but they can't say it's illegal because California will be a state, not a territory. Utah and New Mexico will come into the Union as territories with popular sovereignty deciding the issue. So Utah and New Mexico get to decide for slavery. The Mormons did have slavery. They don't like to talk about it. It's one of these secrets that nobody wants to hear about. But they don't have it like the old South did. It's not going to be to the same extent. Very unlikely that Utah would probably vote to be pro-slavery in most cases. Same thing with New Mexico. It's just not practical in those areas. So does number 1 and number 2 favor the North or the South? Somebody said the North. Yeah, you're right. It's going to favor the North so far. Because even though technically slavery could go into Utah and New Mexico, probably won't happen. And definitely won't happen if California is a free state. Next, slave trade is banned in the District of Columbia. Who does that favor? North. Definitely the North. So the first 3 items in the Compromise of 1850 so far favor the North. You've got to do something to get the South to go along with this. And so to throw a bone to the South, to get the South to compromise means both sides give, right? Stronger fugitive slave laws passed. This one has teeth in it. It makes it illegal to interfere with the reclaiming of a slave. And it goes even further than that. It says that if a slaveholder comes into Boston, say, he looks down the street, he sees an escaped slave that he recognizes, he doesn't just go and reclaim that slave himself. He can go to this guy nearby, a northerner who's laying bricks, minding his own business, not doing anything except his job. That slaveholder can take that bricklayer and force him to come aid in the capturing of that slave, and it's actually illegal for the bricklayer to say no. Now, northerners really hate this, because think about this. If you're that bricklayer, you might not care anything about slavery. To you, it's just not even an issue. But suddenly this law comes along that says you have to actually participate in the process and be a henchman to essentially the crime of kidnapping. You're going to have a big problem with that. See why northerners don't like that? What's so ironic about this is the North is still going to defy this law, despite the extra teeth that are in it. And the basis upon which they defy this law is states' rights. Who usually claims states' rights over federal supremacy? The South. And the South is going to claim federal supremacy. Hey, state, you can't disobey this law. The federal government's supreme. So it completely reversed their position just due to the particular situation. Next, Texas accepts smaller present-day boundaries in exchange for the federal government paying its $10 million debt. When Texas was a republic from 1836 to 1845, it accrued a debt, had some debt left over from the Texas Revolution. Look how big Texas used to be. See that blue area on that map? Isn't that huge? Now think about this. Some of the best ski country in Colorado used to be part of Texas. So next time you go to Vail or Aspen, go up the lift with somebody from Colorado and tell them that they used to be part of Texas. See what they say. Just be sure you're not over a really high drop when you say that. And look at this, even part of Wyoming used to be part of Texas. So you're going to pay Texas its $10 million debt in exchange for taking its smaller present-day boundaries. Why would the North want Texas to have less territory? And Texas is a state, not a territory. Why would the North want Texas to have less soil, less land? Well, yes, because slavery could spread. Slavery could spread to those areas because Texas is technically a slave state. It does not have slavery to, say, the extent of Mississippi or Alabama, but technically slavery is allowed there, and so technically slavery could spread up there. Again, probably not much use for it up in this part, but nevertheless, the North wants to limit the spread of slavery, so you want to make Texas smaller. That's why you do this. Significance of the Compromise of 1850. Number one, you avoid the Civil War for another 10 years. You avoid the Civil War for another 10 years. I'll explain why that's important in just a minute. Number two, you temporarily solve the problem of the spread of slavery into the territories. Bless you. Did I say permanently? I said temporarily. Temporarily solves the problem of the spread of slavery into the territories. And number three, starts the 1850s off from a position of peace. So we're going to start the decade of the 1850s off from a position of peace. Now let me explain to you why it's so important that the Civil War is delayed 10 years. If the Civil War had occurred in 1850, it is very, very likely that the South would have won instead of the North. And this is because in 1850, the two sides are far more evenly matched. The North still has more people. The North still has more industrialization and technology and transportation and logistics, all that kind of stuff. But the preponderance of that advantage is far less than it will be 10 years later in 1860. See, during the 1850s, the South pretty much stays stagnant. You don't really build many railroads. You don't really industrialize very much. You pretty much stay the same. You don't have much immigration. The North has a huge flood of immigrants come in, mostly from Ireland. And so the population goes up. You have more people to fight the war. And you industrialize. You're going to build more factories. You're going to build more railroads. You're going to be much more able to fight an industrialized type of war in 1860 than you are in 1850 in the North. So the two sides are much more evenly matched. The South probably would have won if you had fought in 1850. Who's president in 1850? Yes, Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor's a hero of the Mexican War. He was okay, but he's no Abraham Lincoln. That's another reason the South probably would have won if you had had the war in 1850 instead of 1860. No Abraham Lincoln as president. With Abraham Lincoln as president, that's one of the key factors in the North winning the Civil War. And even with Abraham Lincoln as president, the South almost wins on a couple of occasions. The idea that the Northern victory was inevitable just is not true. The South almost wins even against Abraham Lincoln and all these other odds. Abraham Lincoln is kind of like George Washington. No one else could have done it. Is the only person that could have done the job that Washington did is Washington. The only person that could do the job that Lincoln did is Lincoln. His almost superhuman persistence in maintaining the war even in the face of what seems certain defeat. So Abraham Lincoln, that persistence and his strategic vision, the way in which he fights the war, these are the things that make Abraham Lincoln indispensable to Northern victory. Here's Zach Taylor, who's known as Old Rough and Ready. His face looks like a catcher's mitt, doesn't it? He'd been out in the sun his whole life. He was a farmer, then a soldier. And in the Mexican War, he's one of the generals that invades Mexico from the north, the northern part of Mexico. He is so plain looking that even as a general, sitting there in the train of troops, messengers would come up looking for the general, and they would think he was just some farmer, and they'd tell him to send a message to the general. He'd just kind of play along and say, sure, I'll give it to him. And he's just sitting there looking all plain and homely. He actually never voted in his entire life. So we've had a president who never voted, never even once. He was not really a Democrat or a Whig before this, but the Whig Party comes in since he's a war hero from the Mexican War, and he says, all right, I'll serve. So he becomes president in 1849, but he dies in 1850. The poor Whig Party just can't catch a break. Who was the previous president that died who was a Whig? First president ever to die in office? Not Polk. Polk doesn't die in office. He dies out of office. William Henry Harrison in 1841. He was elected in 1840. Harrison was only president 1 month. Zachary Taylor will be president about a year. So he's president from 1849 to 1850. In July of 1850, he goes out to watch the dedication of the Washington Monument. It's sweltering hot. Anybody ever been to Washington, D.C. in the summertime? Anybody ever been to Houston in the summertime? It's about the same sort of thing. It's just insufferable, right? So he goes out there in that heat. He comes in, there's no air conditioning to escape to. So to cool himself off, he tries to drink some chilled cherries and milk. And he has some sort of acute gastrointestinal reaction to the concoction, and he dies a couple days later. So Zachary Taylor dies. This is actually fortuitous for the United States, because Zachary Taylor had vowed to veto the Compromise of 1850. If Taylor had lived, we would not have had the Compromise of 1850. Instead, his vice president becomes president, and that's Millard Fillmore. Anybody ever heard of him? Millard Fillmore is probably the most obscure president we've ever had. He's not going to run for re-election. He's just vice president under Taylor, and after Taylor dies, he's president for 3 years. Some people actually felt so sorry for poor old Millard Fillmore, they actually went out and started something called the Millard Fillmore Society. So that's Millard Fillmore for you. We're going to start talking about the 1850s now. This is incredibly important. Just about every year through the decade of the 1850s, you have some sort of sectional crisis. You're just going to have a train of these events, each one dividing the country further than ever before. So we start the 1850s off from a position of peace. The Compromise of 1850 had gone through. The United States is mostly at peace, north and south. You're not happy necessarily with the Compromise of 1850, but you're willing to abide by it and live with it. Compromise of 1850 had solved the question of the spread of slavery into the territories. Look at our map there. Is there anywhere that this question has not been answered? California, free state. Has the question been answered there? Yes. Utah, New Mexico, popular sovereignty. Has the question been answered there? What about over here in the old Louisiana Purchase territory? Has the question been answered there? Yes. Remember the Missouri Compromise and the 3630 line? All territory north of that line is what? Free. All territory south of that line is slave. So this territory is going to be slave territory. This territory is going to be free territory due to that 3630 line. So the question of the spread of slavery into the territories has been solved at the beginning of the 1850s. You start the decade off at a position of peace, and it's like a 10-year root canal. By the time you get to 1860, the whole issue is reopened, and you go from peace to sticking bayonets in your fellow Americans at the end of this decade. So there's got to be a lot of really bad stuff happening in the 1850s, doesn't there? This is some of the fundamental causation of the Civil War, which is a series of events, each one a bigger sectional crisis than the last. So let's start off here. We're going to talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin first. This is your first in your series of events of the 1850s. Please put this in bold on your study guide if it's not there already. Okay, so in 1852, you have Harriet Beecher Stowe. She lives in Ohio. She is the daughter of an abolitionist preacher. Her father is Henry Ward Beecher. Let's find a map here. So she lives in Ohio. It's a free state, but it's right across the Ohio River from the slave state of Kentucky. That's going to be important later. Her father is the abolitionist preacher, Henry Ward Beecher. He's probably the most famous abolitionist preacher in the entire United States. Her husband's an abolitionist preacher. She has several brothers, each of which is an abolitionist preacher. You see a pattern here? So she comes from a long family of abolitionists who are all hardcore abolitionists. She does not like slavery. She wants to do something to attack slavery and show people how evil slavery is. But instead of just writing an essay that says slavery is evil because of X, Y, and Z, she decides to tell a story. Telling a story can be much more effective than just stating the reasons outright. It injects emotion into it, doesn't it? Brings out an emotional component. Well, she's a brilliant writer. She writes this book. Has anybody ever read it? Nobody? It's still assigned in high school a lot. Not every high school, but it's still common to find people who have read this. It's incredibly important historically. It's also incredibly important as American literature. So Uncle Tom's Cabin, she writes this as a serial. And I don't mean like Lucky Charms. Serial this way. So you publish one chapter a month or a week in a weekly magazine like Harper's Weekly or a monthly magazine like Harper's Monthly. It is so popular that the demand is so high that once it's published chapter by chapter, they finally start publishing it as an individual book. It's going to absolutely explode. It sells more copies than the latest Harry Potter book that everybody's waiting for. You see people lined up outside the bookstore like a month before the book comes out, and they're like camping out. This is even higher demand than that. People cannot get enough of Harriet Beecher Stowe. They can't keep this thing in print. There's only 3 books that sell this high in the 19th century, and this is number 3. The first 2 are the Bible, of course, and Shakespeare. And then Uncle Tom's Cabin. Even by today's standards in our country of 300 million people, Uncle Tom's Cabin would be a bestseller. And back then, the country's only 20 million people. There's some things you need to know about this book, some characters. First of all, the character Uncle Tom. He's the hero of the book. Now, if somebody comes up to you and says you're an Uncle Tom today, that's usually an insult, right? There's nothing insulting about the character of Uncle Tom in the book. He is a saintly figure. He's a slave, he's an elderly man, but he is a perfect human being. He's very Christ-like. He's kind, he's gentle, he's wise. He never says anything wrong, never does anything wrong. He's perfect. He's the most emulatable, honorable man you could imagine. A perfect human being. But he's a slave. His owner is a man by the name of Simon Legree. Simon Legree is this cackling, dastardly villain. Anybody ever seen those silent films from the 20s? We've got this villain in the long flowing black cape, and they've got the handlebar mustache and the top hat, and they're laughing to themselves, or they tie some maiden to a railroad track. That's the archetype of the villain in the vaudeville era. It's also that archetype is begun by Simon Legree in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Simon Legree is cruel, he is evil, he beats Uncle Tom just for the pleasure of it. Uncle Tom never does anything wrong, so he never deserves these beatings. And Simon Legree, Harriet Beecher Stowe very cleverly makes him a northerner. So he's not a southerner. She makes him a northerner who came from the north, came down to Kentucky. The novel takes place in Kentucky. And becomes a slaveholder. The reason she's doing this is to make a very subtle but powerful point. She's trying to indict the institution of slavery and say that slavery is evil, not that Southerners are evil. If she'd made Simon Legree a Southerner, the reader would have said, of course he acts like that, he's a Southerner. That's how Southerners behave. But she makes him a Northerner, and her audience is Northerners, right? What she's saying to them is, there, but by the grace of God go you. This could happen to you if you were a slaveholder. You're all Simon Legrees. Because slavery is ultimately a tyranny. It gives you absolute power over the life of another human being. And power corrupts, doesn't it? Americans believe that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Slavery is a form of absolute power. And she says, it's not Simon Legree who's the monster, it's not Southerners who's the monster, it's slavery that's the monster. It corrupts you, it makes you do these things. So that's her point, and it's a very subtle, very effective point. Another character in the novel, Eliza, she's a young slave woman, she's got a baby. She's trying to escape from slavery. One of the most famous moments of the novel, she is leaping from ice floe to ice floe across the frozen Ohio River, trying to make it from Kentucky into Ohio, and escape from slavery. And in the background, you hear the dogs baying on her trail. She is about to be captured. Very, very dramatic. It is one of the most famous moments in American literature, depicted in songs, in movies, in paintings, in cartoons. Anybody ever see the old black and white Mickey Mouse cartoons? Or any of the old black and white movies from the 30s, 40s, what have you? You'll see all sorts of cultural references to Uncle Tom, even though this is almost 100 years later. You'll sometimes see cultural references to Uncle Tom's Cabin even today. Usually in a negative way today, but originally this is a very highly esteemed icon of American literature. You'd have to be living under a rock, like the guy in the Geico commercial, to not get the message of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Is it so widely spread throughout the North that every Northerner has heard of this? Even if you could not read, people are talking about it on every street corner. Even if you could not read, they make plays out of this, and people attend plays very commonly in the North in the 19th century. So you're going to get the message of Uncle Tom's Cabin. What it does is several things. First of all, it's going to sensitize an entire generation to the evils of slavery. Most Northerners were anti-slavery before this, but they were passively anti-slavery. Let me explain what that means. So if you came up to a Northerner and you said, "Hey buddy, are you for slavery?" He'd say, "No, I hate it, I'm against it." "Have you ever done anything against slavery?" "No, not really, don't really care about it that much, I haven't thought about it." You say you're against it, but it's not really in your face. It's not something that you consciously care about on a daily basis. It's just like starving children on the continent of Africa today. How many of you know there's starving children on the continent of Africa today? Well, raise your hand. I'm sure all of us know that, right? It's common knowledge. How many of you have actually done something to help those starving children? Couple of people. Does that mean the rest of us are heartless, cruel people who don't care about starving children? No. It just means it's out of sight and out of mind. It's not something that's an immediate concern, it's a distant concern, right? I guarantee you every last one of you would do something if you had to step over a starving child to get to class every morning. Then it wouldn't be out of sight, out of mind. It would be right there in front of you. Most Northerners have never been to the South. They've never seen slaves. They've never seen slavery. Most Southerners had never been to the North, so you've got this kind of gap between them. What Uncle Tom's Cabin does is it humanizes slavery. It sensitizes the entire generation of Northerners to the evil of slavery, but it humanizes the plight of the slaves. Now when they read in the newspaper and they see the word slaves, instead of just seeing the black and white words on the page, who do they think of? Uncle Tom and Eliza, right? Now when they read in the newspaper and they see the word slaveholder or Southerner, even though technically Simon Legree is not a Southerner, who do they think of? Simon Legree. And so it demonizes slaveholders and humanizes slaves. It injects emotion into the equation. It makes an entire generation of Northerners actively anti-slavery rather than passively anti-slavery. Second thing it does is it's going to alienate the South. Southerners think that this book is inaccurate, not a correct depiction of how slavery actually is, not a correct depiction of how slaveholders actually treat slaves. And in most cases, they're probably right, but there's definitely some very cruel, evil slaveholders out there. If you've ever seen pictures of the whip scars on the backs of some freed slaves, So you definitely have some people that are that bad. Technically, probably not all slaveholders are that way. The slaveholders are resenting this. They say it's inaccurate. They try to counter it with propaganda of their own. They say this is Northern propaganda. If you were caught with a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the Old South in the 1850s, you would be hanged first and questions asked later. Because they think you're an abolitionist trying to start a slave rebellion by circulating anti-slavery propaganda. They counter with some books of their own. For instance, they write a book that's called Uncle Robin in His Cabin in Virginia and Uncle Tom in Pennsylvania Without One. What a convoluted title, right? The whole point was they're trying to say, well, slaves, once they get elderly like Uncle Tom, the slaveholder takes care of them even when they can't work anymore. They have a house they're caring for, etc., like part of the family. That's not really accurate, but that's what they're claiming. And if you're a factory worker in the North, you get old, you can't work in the factory anymore, what happens to you? Is the factory going to take care of you? No, you're out on your ear, and you're probably going to be starving in the streets unless you had some sort of savings. So their plan was to contrast slavery with Northern factory workers. That doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. Harriet Beecher Stowe is going to meet Abraham Lincoln in 1862. Abraham Lincoln greets Harriet Beecher Stowe with these words. He says, "Oh, the little lady that started this great big war." Now, do you think Abraham Lincoln literally believed Harriet Beecher Stowe started the Civil War? No. What he's using is a little bit of hyperbole. That means exaggeration to make a point. He's trying to say she didn't specifically cause this, but the sensitization that her book leads to is a key ingredient. It's not a cause of the Civil War, but without that, maybe the North wouldn't have been as willing to fight over secession. With that book, the North is more willing to be actively against Southern attempts at disunion and secession. See the difference? It also shapes the character of the war, so that the war, even though it doesn't start about slavery, it starts about preserving the Union. It will shape the character of the war so that eventually, by 1863, it does become a war to end slavery. I'm going to move on to the Kansas-Nebraska Act now. This one is 1854. If you see me abbreviate this on the board, just know that's Kansas-Nebraska. Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is probably one of the key components in the causation of the Civil War. No single event causes the Civil War, but this is one of those ingredients that without which you probably would not have had the Civil War when it happens and how it happens. It's very key to the actual coming of the Civil War. It's also one of the stupidest laws ever passed in the history of this country. And that's really saying something, because boy, do we have some doozies. So, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Here we have Stephen A. Douglas. He's a senator from Illinois. He's a Democrat. You need to know that. Which party they are really matters. If they're Democrat or Whig or Democrat or Republican, whatever, you got to know that. He's a Democrat. He's a Northern Democrat. He wants to be president. Remember those problems that Northern Democrats have when it comes to slavery? How do you have to walk that tightrope between not being too anti-slavery or too pro-slavery? Well, he's got to do something to get Northerners to like him. And it can't be on the issue of slavery, because that'll alienate the Democrats in the South, who are the base of the party. So he wants to do something that will capture the imagination of Northerners and say to Northerners, this is a presidential, statesman-like man, pick him as president. What he decides to do is he wants to get a northern route for a transcontinental railroad. He wants a northern route for a transcontinental railroad. So he's from Chicago, right here. You get a northern route for a transcontinental railroad, it'll come like this. You've wanted a transcontinental railroad ever since 1849 and the gold rush of 1849, and now that California is a state, without it being connected to the rest of the Union, it's almost like an island floating over here by itself. You want to connect it. So the idea of a transcontinental railroad is not new. But anytime a Southerner proposed a southern route for a transcontinental railroad, Northerners in Congress shot that down because they don't want a southern route that would favor the South over the North. Anytime a Northerner proposed a northern route for a transcontinental railroad, Southerners in Congress would shoot it down because that favors the North over the South. So sectional discord, sectional disagreement means no transcontinental railroad. To get his transcontinental railroad, if he can get a northern route for transcontinental railroad, would Northerners like that? Absolutely. Northerners would be cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs over that, wouldn't they? That would absolutely make him presidential. It would be an incredible boost to the northern economy. It would tie in the New York, the Great Lakes, Chicago, and California all in one big line, economically supporting one another. The prosperity of the North would go up immensely. So a very key thing. If he can pull that off, it would be a very good thing economically for the North. But to get the South to go along with that, he's got to throw them a bone, doesn't he? Otherwise, Southerners will just shoot this down like they have previous attempts at a northern route. So he's got to give something to the South to get the South to go along with this. He's also got to do something about this unorganized territory in the middle. Because if the railroad crosses unorganized territory, the railroad companies, which are privately owned and not government run, will not build there. See, railroads have to make a profit. And if you've got this railroad going from Illinois to California, and you're shipping stuff across there, yeah, you make a little bit of money, but you don't make money on the long haul. You make money on the short haul. You need customers all along the route, and you need this territory organized. Unorganized territory, there's no law and order there. You're going to take a valuable train somewhere where it's not illegal to steal that train? I sure wouldn't. So you got to do something to organize that territory, provide law and order. And another cause of organizing this and getting law and order out there, people will start to move out there. You need people to live all along that route. You need towns. You got to have coaling stations for the train to refill its coal bunkers. You got to have water towers for the train to refill its water boilers. You can't just leave this blank. You got to have people living out there to make this profitable. So bottom line, he's got to organize that territory to get this done, and he needs to throw a bone to the South to get the South to go along with this. So in his mind, he comes up with what he thinks is a brilliant plan. He says, people don't really care about the spread of slavery anymore after the Compromise of 1850. I'm going to do away with the 3630 line and create two more territories in this area called Kansas and Nebraska, with the tacit understanding that the northernmost of these territories, Nebraska, is for northern settlement and is free, and the tacit understanding that Kansas, the southernmost, is pro-slavery and will become a slave territory. So look at this. I'm going to go back and forth. This is the before picture. You see? Notice the 3630 line. So is slavery allowed in that area? No. It's absolutely forbidden in that area by federal law under the Missouri Compromise. The 3630 line forbids it. Look at the after picture. Is there a 3630 line anymore? So what law repeals the 3630 line? Kansas-Nebraska Act. So if you're asked on the test, what makes the 3630 line unconstitutional, you would answer something different. If you're asked what repeals the 3630 line, you would answer Kansas-Nebraska Act. It's a key difference. Be sure you understand that. So you have two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Now Douglas is a Northern Democrat. All the Democrats in Congress, pro-slavery, they vote for this. You also get Whigs to go along with this, though, especially Northern Whigs. It's how you get it through Congress. Northern Whigs like this law because to them, Whigs are always kind of a little bit wishy-washy on the issue of slavery. They'll talk about being against it, but they won't actually stand up to it when it tries to spread somewhere. And Whigs say, well, this is a compromise. The North gets all the economic benefits from the Transcontinental Railroad. Allowing slavery to maybe spread into Kansas is kind of a non-issue. And so both Whigs and Democrats misread the American people and think that the American people, especially in the North, don't really care about the spread of slavery anymore. Boy, are they wrong. Don't you wish you had telephone poles back then? If you had telephone poles, I'm not talking the pole that holds the telephone wire. I mean calling you up and doing a political poll and asking if you're for and against something. If they had polled this issue with American people, they would have realized this is a no-go. You don't want to go here. But you don't have polls back then. You have to just do whatever you think is best and hope that the people like it. And the American people in the North absolutely hate the Kansas-Nebraska Act. To them, it is the most loathsome piece of slime ever to come crawling out of a swamp somewhere. They despise the Kansas-Nebraska Act with a purple hatred. Northerners hate this thing. Southerners, they're indifferent to it. They kind of like it. They could just maybe spread slavery to Kansas. And keep in mind, the idea that Kansas is supposed to be a slave territory is not written in the actual law. It's a gentleman's agreement between congressmen that say, well, this top territory will be for the Northerners, this bottom territory will be for the Southerners, and slavery. Could slavery spread to Kansas, by the way? Can you grow cotton in Kansas? Well, you can in some places, especially along the river. You can in Missouri, right next door along the river. So maybe a little bit, not nearly as much as maybe Alabama or Mississippi. But you do have some agriculture there. You could do wheat farming or something, which is what Kansas is very famous for, corn and wheat and that kind of thing. Definitely not to the same cash crop level of slavery use that you do in a cotton state, but you could do a little bit. The Whig Party is going to die because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Up to this point, if you were anti-slavery, you could not be a Democrat, because the Democratic Party is the party of slavery. After the war, the Democratic Party is going to be the party of segregation and Jim Crow. So the Democratic Party is the party of slavery, the party of secession, the party of segregation and Jim Crow. That's the Democratic Party. You can't be a Democrat and be anti-slavery. The position of the party is pro-slavery. So if you were anti-slavery, which party were you usually